As the end of 2014 approaches, it is a chance to look back at what has been a momentous year in the Middle East. With all that is happening, and still happening right now in the Middle East, in a sense the end of the year is an arbitrary date, because the refugee crisis in Syria, the Syrian civil war, the problems in Iraq, none of these have gone away as the year has come to a close. In fact, in some way, they've only got worse. But it is an opportunity to look back at what has been a transformative year in the region and try to understand some of the trends that have shaped 2014. The story of the summer, and very much the story of the year, has been the rise of the Islamic State in Syria and the Levant, this dramatic imposition of what was previously a little-known militant group upon the landscape of the Middle East and the consciousness of the world. The story of ISIL is really a story of borders and the story of how different life on the ground can be from the lines on a map. ISIL, in its rise in Syria and later in Iraq, was not bounded by these arbitrary lines in the sand. Instead, they worked with what was there. In particular, they worked with the extensive links of families and friendship and business and political allegiances. Collectively, you might refer to this as tribal links that stretch east to west across the vast desert between Iraq and Syria. It was a road along this axis that has been traveled many times with many other conquerors and attempted challenges throughout history. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the year came in July when ISIL's leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi climbed the minbar at Mosul's Great Mosque and declared himself caliph. But behind that moment lies a hinterland of history. The beginnings of ISIL go back further than just the summer of 2014. They go back in some way to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and even beyond it into the half-century of stagnation and attempted control of nation-states in the Arab world which preceded it. ISIL in 2014 was the beneficiary of two political trends that existed for some time in the region and beyond it. One was the changing nature of jihad, and the other was the failure of the nation-state in much of the Middle East. Both had been occurring for some time, but both had been occurring below the surface, largely unseen. With regard to the nation-states, for decades, piece by piece, corruption, unemployment, police brutality, and the excesses of the security state had all hollowed out the Arab states in Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Libya. And it was only when the shock of the Arab Spring rippled through these countries that these states that had once seemed so strong were revealed to be, at their core, very fragile. Couple this with a mutating jihad that had not merely sought to undermine states as Al-Qaeda had wanted, but in fact had sought to supplant the Arab nation-state. This jihadi vision of controlling a nation-state in the heart of the Middle East came up against the broken states in Syria and Iraq. In that sense, ISIL was not the cause, but merely the symptom. The failure of the Syrian state allowed a civil war to rage across the country, offering ungoverned spaces to jihadis to gather, plan, and organize. Similarly, the failure of the Iraqi state did the same, with the end result that a transnational terrorist organization could come into being with the possibility of establishing a state in the Middle East. ISIL may have come about because of the failure of states, but the end result of their threat will be to reintroduce the power of states. Already, new allegiances within the region are forming and new alliances beyond it are taking shape. The single most important event of 2014, then, is not the actions of ISIL, but the reaction of Arab states. For the states of the Middle East, the threat of ISIL made clear changes that were already occurring in the Middle East and made clear some new understandings that are now reshaping the policy of the region, and in time will fundamentally reshape the alliances of the region. The first of these is an understanding that just as the threats of the region are too big to have been caused by any one person, they are also too big to be solved by any one person or any one state, and that includes even the United States, the traditional guarantor of security in the region. That security umbrella is failing because of new threats, because of a lack of funds, because of a lack of political attention. And Middle Eastern states, especially in the Gulf, now understand that they will need to involve themselves more in the affairs of their neighbors. For too long, the security of the region was decided and to some degree implemented in foreign capitals, in particular in Washington, in London and Paris. But what the ISIL crisis showed is that having policy priorities decided abroad is no longer sustainable. The idea of foreign powers having influence in the region stretches back to the colonial period and had occurred for so long that people thought of it as the status quo. But the rise of ISIL has forced the region into this new political reality. And right now you can see that reality taking shape. The idea of non-interference in the affairs of other Arab countries is unraveling. Saudi Arabia went into Bahrain, the UAE sent its fighter jets into the skies over Syria, and now with Egypt's new president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Arab world's largest country is being drawn into an alliance with the Arab world's richest country, Saudi Arabia. As a regional power, Saudi Arabia is now being pulled into discussions and understandings and rapprochement with its longtime enemy, Iran. So the lines are being redrawn, although only the outline is now clear. But the direction of travel is obvious, and these new understandings and alliances will change the Middle East, and it is that which will be the legacy of ISIL. Another understanding that has grown out of the ISIL crisis is perhaps the most fundamental, and that is the end of the doctrine of containment. ISIL grew out of the failure of two states, Syria and Iraq, but it also grew out of a belief that then became a doctrine that became a policy, that the problems of the region could be contained within countries, that the lines of the map could be the borders of fires. If you look back, this was the logic of what happened in 1948 after hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes as Israel carved out a new country. These refugees ended up in neighboring Arab countries. The Palestinian model was to contain each of these crises within national borders, to treat each instance of the Palestinian refugee crisis as discrete and unconnected to the others. Over the years, this doctrine of containment, what Kissinger once called administering rather than resolving conflict, became the default policy. So that in Iraq, in particular in 1991, after the first Gulf War, the West believed that it could set out no-fly zones, police them, and you could sanction Saddam Hussein's government into submission. The same thing happened in Libya for many years and in Iran for many decades. But the idea of containment in a Middle Eastern context relied on strong states functioning and relied on limited internal and external pressure on those states. The ISIL threat, coming as it did when Syria was in civil war and Iraq was riven with sectarian tension, could not be contained within one country. Within a matter of weeks, over the summer of 2014, ISIL destroyed the idea of containment. In the end, long after ISIL is defeated and departs from the scene, that will be their legacy, whether they want it or not. The rise of ISIL has changed the Middle East, not because of what the group has done, but because of the way the Arabs have reacted to that threat. The fires of this militant group have burned away the doctrine of containment and forged alliances among the Arabs that will endure beyond this year and beyond this decade. Even after ISIL vanish, they will still have left a mark upon the Middle East.